Hello, welcome back to the Church in the World, Theology 345. This is Dr. Gregory Jones. I'm coming to you from my office, and I want to share some information with you. This is our second lecture that we'll do. I did an orientation lecture with you, and what I want to do to begin this work is to share some information with you. We're going to look at institutions today. And we're going to talk about some vocabulary today to begin this work by Walter Wink. We're talking about the powers that be, the powers that be. Although this is a book that is somewhat dated, it's still very relevant to the issue that we'll be dealing with today, which is nonviolence. And we want to talk about what Wink is beginning to form out as his theses as it relates to understanding nonviolence and how we ought to respond to it. So let's begin. The first thing I want to do is, and I'm going to I have a PowerPoint that I will put on Blackboard for you to peruse and look at, but I want you to consider the suffering of God and the suffering of humankind. And what I want you to think about in the beginning of this work is God's passibility or impassibility. And let me just share with you what that means. When we talk about God's impassibility, we're talking about God's lack of empathy or connection to the human experience. Is God connected to the suffering and the struggles that we see humankind going with? And if he is, or if God is, how is God responding to that? The other word that I want you to think about is God passible? So it's two words, impassibility, lack of empathy for humankind or creation, or God's passibility, God's freedom to have empathy for God's creation and humankind. So I want you to think about that, and I want you to go to the PowerPoint and look at some of the reasoning behind God's, those who think God is impassible or God is possible. Okay, so I want you to look at those two terms on the PowerPoint. We're going to begin our day with looking at institutions, and we're going to talk a little about how Wink begins to form out his notion of the powers. He's talking about the powers that be. What are these powers? First of all, I want you to understand that when Wink thinks about the world and thinks about the spiritual realm, and this is a very spiritual text, when he talks about the notion of spirituality, the demonic, if you will, those things that alienate God and God's people, what Wink is not talking about is some form of satanic image or some type of demonic image that you would see in popular genre or you would see in popular religious genre in terms of who Satan is and his minions and the demonic. He's not talking about that. So he's not talking about some harried, red, skilled, horned individual. When Wink talks about the demonic, and when he thinks about the demonic in society, he is thinking about institutions in society that have gone awry. And a classic example that I will give you is, say, the cigarette company, which is an institution in society that creates a product, and that product basically impacts the health, the interests of the population. In other words, the cigarette companies knowingly produce a product that is detrimental to the health of our society. And basically, we create policies and laws that say, well, it's okay for them to do that. Wink would call that a demonic or a demonizing influence that has taken hold of that particular industry. So let me give you some institutions that he says that this kind of demonic activity can take place. He talks about the state, politics, education, religion, the military, science, and technology as being possible institutions or structures of power in our society that can be made to be demonic or can be found demonic. Hospitals, for example, and their treatment or lack of treatment of individuals. Food industries and their blatantly disregard for the health of individuals. And of course, the auto industry, where we see instruments being produced that cause dramatic, horrific effects. I'm thinking about the airbag controversy, where the industry actually knowingly misproduces a product and it causes harm or suffering. So he's saying that these institutions that were originally created for the good of society have somehow been captured in a demonic quality, and he writes about that. And so I want you to read early on in the first chapter or so about the institutions and powers. Later on, we'll talk about the demonic systems, the dominating systems that exist, and we'll talk about some of his history in terms of that. But he talks about these institutions. Now, he says that these institutions can be taken apart and put back together in a way in which it can be redeemed and healed from the kind of activities that he would call demonic that we see them happening in. We will talk about that a little later. What I want to do right now is I want to, so remember when he talks about institutions, when he talks about those things that are demonic in society, he is not disconnecting that demonic activity, spiritually speaking, with what's going on in terms of institutions, organizations, and industries in society. And he's saying that is part of the problem. That is part of the problem in terms of our notion of what is right and wrong, and our ability to kind of separate ourselves from those institutions that we see are involved in demonic activity. So let me go through these worldviews, and so that you can get an understanding about how the history of these worldviews begin to form out and create these institutions in modern society. The first worldview that I want us to take a look at is the ancient worldview. This, you'll see this image in your text. And what the ancient worldview is about is what happens in earth happens in heaven. So there's a corresponding activity that takes place between earth and heaven. When there is physical activity that's going awry on earth, then there's spiritual activity or conflict taking place in heaven. One of the books that we recently saw come out in terms of literary genre is This Present Darkness, which was a series of books that talked about spiritual warfare going on in the heavens, and there was activity, negative activities going on work. That's an ancient, what we would call an ancient worldview, before or right around the 1st century. Later on, we see a spiritual worldview, a little later in terms of the development of civilization. We see individuals coming out of religious community that says basically matter is bad, all things that are of a material aspect or physical aspect are bad, and all things that are connected spiritually are good. So matter is bad, physical nature is bad, all life, all organic kinds of reactions and relationships are seen to be less than or less valuable or less complete, and those things that are happening spiritually in ourselves and in creation are good. Those things that happen in heaven are good. Those things that happen on earth are bad. And this doesn't, we don't have to say that this is still ancient. We can come to the conclusion that these are some attitudes and traditions and worldviews that people still hold. People still hold today that there are certain things that happen of a physical nature that are evil, and things that happen of a spiritual nature are good. But that's a very ancient or I would say older spiritualist worldview. The next worldview that I want to look at, the third worldview we want to look at, is the materialist worldview, which is just the opposite. The materialists say everything on earth and physicality is good, and everything spiritual, well, there is no spirituality. We should just revoke that out of our thinking. We should, and this is with the age of enlightenment. We see the enlightenment coming in and talking about how the physical nature of man is a positive thing. There is no spirit. Those things that we do see that are spiritual are concoctions made by man in order to control society. When we look at John Locke, and when we look at Hobbes and some of the other philosophers, we see individuals writing about the creation of religion and creation of the spiritual nature just so that man can be controlled. But man in enlightenment is a physical being, and that's what we need to concentrate our efforts and time and energy in. The enlightenment, the materialistic worldview. Finally, we come to a worldview, the fourth worldview, the theological worldview, which is heaven talks about why, and earth is science. It talks about how. So it divides. The theological worldview says, well, theology, the study of God, tells you the why, and the sciences, as we see them, the stems, talk to you about how the earth moves, how the earth is formed. The theologians tell you why the earth is formed. And so that theological worldview is the fourth worldview we come upon, and we see that kind of emerging into, not, I wouldn't say postmodern, but definitely modern society. We see the theological worldview where the theologians handle the realm of the why, and the scientists handle the realm of the how. Finally, and the one that I think Wink is embracing, is what he calls the integral worldview, the inner and outer worldview. In other words, when we talk about God, we cannot talk about God separate from the creation. In other words, everything that's in creation is a part of God. Creation, the creation story, and all of nature holds on to God's part of God's attribute and characteristic. And so when we talk about this, we more or less are entering into the realm of the Native American community, where the Native American says that every aspect of nature is alive and a part of God. And when we start talking about the yin and the yang and the Mobius strip, and you'll see him mention these things in the text itself about what is going on in those communities, non-aggressive communities, about nature and God, that they are one in the same. And so let me give you two terms after these worldviews that you might want to pay attention to. One is called pantheism. Pantheism, spelled P-A-N-T-H-E-I-S-M. Everything is God. Everything is God. Everything that you see, everything that you touch, everything that exists is God. That is one worldview, or one way of looking at who and what God is in the world. But he suggests that there is another that we need to be take into consideration, and that one is panentheism. That's spelled P-A-N-E-N-T-H-E-I-S-M, where everything is in God and God is in everything. That is a more complete perspective from Walter Wink's point of view, as he understands the nature and the power of God. And so understand how Wink is dealing with God. God is, from this perspective, in all things. So when we look at institutions, when we look at social constructs, when we look at society, when we look at individuals, then God is a part of every day's activity, and there's an inner and outer nature of that activity, and that activity can be of a positive nature or a negative nature. And so he's looking at it in a little bit different than what we traditionally understand it to be. And that is where he gets his understanding of the nature of the powers that be. These institutions are organizations with individuals in them, and these powers don't start out to be negative powers, but what happens is that they get influenced, and they get influenced negatively by those things that he would term demonic. And so let me share this last concept with you. I've given you a lot today to begin with, but this last concept, he says, he's talking about these powers now. Remember, I said the state, I said the politics, education, religion, the military, science, technology, and if we reduce that a bit more, we talk about hospitals, we talk about stores, we talk about organizations that people are part of. All of these powers are seen to be originally as good, but they have fallen. And when he talks about the fallenness of the powers, he's talking about they have become demonic in terms of their activity. So they originally start out, when people first started hospitals, they wanted to do positive things. When people started the military, when people started the government, when people started educational institutions, they wanted to do good things. But somehow, some way, they have been influenced to be less than what they originally intended to be. And we'll talk about original intent and where that word comes from, in the Latin word. We'll get to that a little bit later. But they're not what they originally intended to be, and so they have basically fallen. And because of their fallenness, there's a responsibility, because we are part of God's creation, we are God's creatures, and God is, from Wing's point of view, be very clear, the passible God, the God that can emotionally and sensitively and empathetically be connected to the suffering of humankind, because emphatically connected God is in terms of the suffering of humankind in such a way that God can move through us to redeem these institutions that have fallen. And so he talks about the powers, those institutions that are originally start out to be good, have fallen, and need to be redeemed. And that is our responsibility. Part of Wing's challenge to us as we begin to look at these institutions, and we'll talk about next time the domination system, and we'll talk about the myth of redemptive violence and some of the other things that he raises in the text. We are called as part of God's creation to work at and be about the business of reclaiming and redeeming these powers that have been corrupted. When we look at in society, and we can look anywhere that we need to, whether it's politics, where different from the state, for example, that spends billions of dollars on campaigns while people go about the business of suffering, demonic. Whether it's Eli Lilly, when he talks about Eli Lilly spending less than a cent on making medications and then charging people $10, $15 a pill. You know, we can just look anywhere in society and see how the corruptibility of these institutions have come to be. All right, I'm going to stop there today. I want you to do the reading, and we'll catch up with our time and our text on next time.